This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Hi, welcome to Storytelling Animals, a podcast about climate, ecology, and other animals, where many episodes I speak to people who write books about these issues and talk to them about their books and the ideas in their books. This is going to be a little different. Well, in one way, it's not different. So my guest today is Kyle Martindale. He is my brother, among other things. He designed the logo for this podcast, and he is the author of a new children's book called The ABCs of the Real Dancing Eagle. The Real Dancing Eagle is a sort of art project that he started where he makes t-shirts, other clothing with different versions of this eagle artwork. He made my logos, I mentioned, and most recently he made a children's book. So I reached out to him wanting to talk about his book for this last episode, but he also suggested that we spend much of it actually talking about my podcast. He's also a listener of Storytelling Animals, and as many of you know, I technically am on hiatus right now. I finished season 2 in August of 2023, and I just started a PhD program in environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, and so I'm taking a break from the podcast. But I wanted to do one last episode with my brother about his book, and he mentioned that he thought it could be a good time to look back at the history of the podcast, or to look back at what I learned from doing the podcast, some of my favorite episodes. So yeah, the first part of this episode is about my brother's work, his children's book, his artwork, The Real Dancing Eagle. But then we transition into kind of looking back, a retrospective on at least the first year and a half of Storytelling Animals podcast. As I mentioned, this is a podcast that is on hiatus. I don't know when, if ever, I'll make a season 3. So whether this is the middle of the road or the end of the road for this podcast, it's still a nice chance to look back and reflect. I had a lot of fun with our conversation. We talked about not only what I learned, but we both shared some formative encounters with non-human animals that we've had. The books that I wish I had written, my goals for the future, stuff like that. If this is the first episode you've ever listened to, you're welcome to give this a shot, but I hope it also encourages you to look back at prior episodes. We both share some of our favorites. And yeah, without further ado, here's Kyle Martindale. I'm here with Kyle Martindale. He is the author of the new children's book, ABCs of the Real Dancing Eagle. He is the designer of the logo for this very podcast, Storytelling Animals. He is my literal brother and figurative. Kyle, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Wow, thank you, Dayton. That was a great introduction.
I worked very hard on it. So on this show, I want to introduce listeners to you and some of what you've been up to, the phenomenon behind this podcast logo, and then Kyle's also going to be asking me some questions about the podcast. In addition to all the things I already said, he is a listener of Storytelling Animals. So this will be, like I said, the last episode, certainly of 2023, and possibly the last episode for a while as I pursue my PhD. So this will be a nice chance to look back on the podcast as it's been. All right, you ready, Kyle?
Sure.
So yeah, let's start with this regular listeners of the pod who have seen my logo know that it features an eagle artwork. This eagle is known as the Dancing Eagle, and you've done a lot of
the Real Dancing Eagle, Dayton.
Forgive me, yes, the Real Dancing Eagle, and there are Real Dancing Eagle T-shirts, doodles on Instagram, now a children's book. At what point did you start doodling eagles?
Well, thank you for asking me, and it is a it's a delight to be a guest on your podcast. As you said accurately, I'm a huge fan, and I love that I get the opportunity to talk about my real dancing eagle, um, phenomenal as you put it, but also to be a part of you reflecting on this podcast, storytelling animals. So when did I start doodling eagles? And I don't know if I was doodling eagles in a past life, but I started at probably about 5 years old.
So it's been a lifelong passion, it sounds like.
I'm just kidding. I'm not going to just leave it there. So I, yeah, 5 years old. I think it's one of the drawings that um, my dad showed me when we would make little stories together, and he had a very kind of reproducible way of drawing an eagle. The little circle and hash hash hash, and then a beak, and then wings hash hash hash, wings hash tail. It's just like, oh, I can do that, and so I ended up drawing lots of eagles, and I think I just was a fan of bald eagles in particular as a kid, and so I drew a lot of eagles as a kid. But then it was about 5 years ago that I kind of unearthed the eagle from my deep subconscious and began doodling them again. And as you mentioned, it started off as an Instagram account where I would just kind of collect my doodles of eagles, and then I started putting them on T-shirts, and then I created an ABC book called ABCs of the Real Dancing Eagle.
What just this is a books podcast. I'm curious just what led to you making it a book.
Well, I think the inspiration of the so as a doodling habit, as a creative expression, as an art project, it definitely inner child connection is definitely one of the themes. So it kind of made sense to do a children's book because it was just it felt freeing for me to be creative in a way that wasn't striving to meet some uh, elusive measure of sophistication, because it's kind of like the stick figure version of an eagle. But yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I encourage people check it out, especially if you have children in your life or inner children. Uh, the artwork is a lot of fun. The ABCs are the eagle doing different dance moves, so kids get to dance along with it. Some of them may be dance moves you've heard of. Some of them may be dance moves that will require more creative interpretation. I have friends who don't know my brother at all who have raved about the book, and it includes a guide on how to draw eagles yourself, in case you didn't quite follow the circle hash hash wing earlier. But so yeah, so that's my pitch for Kyle's book. Is there anything else about the Real Dancing Eagle we should know? What you're working on now, or just any more context for the project?
Yeah, so as humble as its beginnings, I cannot help but be tempted by grandiose visions for it. Pretty much taking over the fashion world and becoming, people say, Eric Carl, the hungry Caterpillar. Who? I don't remember. Um, Wherever you see, a polo player embroidered on a shirt, or a penguin, or a crocodile. Instead, you'll see a dancing eagle. Um, so that's my vision for it. But what I like doing is taking pictures of people dancing, taking them myself, or acquiring them from people such as yourself, and friends who send me a fun picture of them dancing, and then I'll kind of create an eagle version of them dancing and slap on a t-shirt. And that's kind of what we're up to. But the next project is probably going to be, we start with the ABC book, and stands to reason that the next one might be a, counting 1, 2, 3s
Ooh.
book. But I might be half done with
Whoa.
not with that one, but with a like artistic masterpieces dancing eagle book, like a dancing eagle version of the Mona Lisa, creation of Adam, even the Da Vinci one from your podcast logo. I feel like I could use, and I think doing like a Guernica
Oh, wow.
of Dancing Eagles could be fun. And yeah, just kind of the Last Supper with Dancing Eagles. So because I already have some content for that one, that might actually be the next project.
Yeah, I think that a version of my logo, which is the eagle as Da Vinci's drawing of the Vitruvian Man, actually makes a cameo in the ABC's book as well. So you can keep your eyes open for that. But yeah, no, I think to kind of bring it into this theme of the show as well. I don't know, to what extent consciously you're doing this, but I think there's a very fun uh, subversion to taking these great works of art of like the history of art, which is seen as this like both humanistic and fundamentally human endeavor, and like giving the Mona Lisa an eagle's head or something is just superficially charming, but but also
Oh, it's only
uh,
superficially charming, is it?
but on a deeper level, it's even more charming. No, it's a fun little reframing. Yeah, you actually, when I was first starting this podcast, you asked me, or you asked me if there were any questions I was planning to ask everyone. And I said I hadn't thought about it. And you said that I should ask people if they've ever had a formative experience with another animal.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked a couple people versions of that question throughout. I ended up not always having time just because I always had so many questions about their books.
Mm-hmm.
But I was always glad when I did, and I wonder if I can turn that around on you. If you have, other than 5-year-old eagle drawings, there are any formative experiences with animals that jump to your mind?
What a generous question. I remember one night being at a park. It was probably 10 or 11 at night. All the lights were off. A very quiet neighborhood. And, there's like a wide open field. And, just out like hanging out with a friend or two. And I'm not exactly sure what we were doing at the park, but we were just kind of out and just being outside. And I saw a coyote come close to us, and I kind of went after it. And it kind of gambled off a little bit, but it was still kind of in the middle of this wide open field. And I was on the track team, cross country team. I wanted to like test my speed, see if I could catch this coyote or even get close to it. So I open up to a full sprint, and the coyote is kind of just like playfully gambling in front of me, just kind of like loping along, and still. And so I ended up getting like kind of close to it, like within 10 feet maybe. And right when I got like a little bit too close for its comfort, it just actually started running and just jetted off. And it was like it disappeared into the night. Um, but for that moment, it was probably like 3 or 4 seconds that I was running at full speed, kind of close, chasing this coyote. But we were playing for sure. Like it didn't. I could tell it wasn't threatened by me.
Uh,
There was a very playful vibe, and so yeah, that's the memory that comes to mind. Just like, oh, an animal and I kind of just played together. This creature and I just played together. We weren't necessarily threatened by each other, and it was mysterious and also just kind of simple.
I don't think I've ever heard that story. Thank you for sharing. I'm so glad I asked. This was in high school?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
That's
this is back in high school.
that's incredible. So yeah, I turn it over to you as a listener of the podcast. Um, I
Yeah.
will
Well,
maybe ask for some thoughts you have on the podcast later, but for now, maybe let's just start with what are the questions that came up for you?
yeah. So listening to your podcast has been kind of a unique pleasure because I'm really interested in the content, and because it's you, my brother, who's recording it, and it's not something that you've done before, and so it was just really fun. But I love that you took that question that I offered of like what formative experiences with animals people might have had, um, because your stories uh, are some of my favorites. Can we should we tease that for the end? At the end, you're gonna give a formative experience encounter you had with an animal.
All
Um,
right.
okay, yeah. So as a fan of the pod and someone privileged to now sit in the interviewer seat to hear your reflections on the podcast, um, I'm curious, looking at the diversity of topics that your podcast covered. How important was the balance to you between kind of what I perceive as being kind of a science based lens and then like a literary based lens?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think toward the very beginning, possibly even before I even recorded an episode, I was thinking about like I had to write a paragraph description of it for some to get it on an app or something, or I was experimenting with different intros, and I think I said something along the lines of covering science, philosophy, literature, and politics, um, those were kind of the four fields I wanted to span. And I think just a lot of my own background is has kind of danced back and forth between the worlds of science and the worlds of the humanities. So my undergrad major was in actually astrophysics, which doesn't directly have to do with podcasts too much, but indirectly has to do a little bit with everything. But I was interested in ecology and climate science and in the scientific aspect of this, but also have always been like a big reader. I took a bunch of English classes, those electives. I've been in multiple book clubs outside of the one that I ran for this podcast. Um, and I think it kind of just reflects my own broad interests that there's an element of just insofar as this podcast was partially a selfish project of could I get cool people to talk with me.
Mm-hmm.
Some days I wanted to talk with scientists, some days I wanted to talk with novelists, um, and I didn't want to constrain that. But also, I think there's some fruitfulness in putting different fields in conversation with each other, even if it's not in the same podcast episode. But just having a place where one is getting, like you said, both scientific and literary perspectives on overlapping issues. I think different disciplines, different fields have a lot to add, and that we, insofar as these issues are siloed, we don't get the full picture. And my program now is I'm getting my PhD in environmental studies at University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm mainly focusing on like ethics and political theory questions, but a lot of people are scientists, social scientists, into econ, into biology, into in my cohort of other first year PhD students in this program, there's a wide range of disciplines, and I just think that's a little more exciting and maybe a little more room for growth or learning new things than um, if we only looked from one direction. So it was an intentional thing, I guess, to answer your question. But
yeah, that resonates with me a lot. It seems like it stems from you having a love for multiple disciplines, a wide variety of disciplines, fields of study, but also your sense of the possibilities of bringing those together and of not limiting um, inquiry to a single silo. Okay, next question. Just be honest. Which was your favorite ep?
ooh, I think a handful that. Well, I'll say the one that I like most kind of geeked out about was when I got to interview Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction novelist. Um, I've read probably a solid dozen of his novels, and been a big fan. And actually interviewed him over email once when I used to work for a magazine in these times. And I'd seen him speak, but I'd never actually like had a full on conversation with him uh, in that way. And so that was the one that I definitely was like, oh my god, I get to talk with Kim Stanley Robinson for an hour and a half and just like ask him about all the books that I love. Um, so that was with all, respect and appreciation for everyone else who came on the show. That was the one that I probably got most hyped about. Yeah, I mean, I think I got different things out of different episodes. A couple of the more recent ones on like the one with Patrice Jones, who co-founded Vine Animal Sanctuary. Um,
Hmm.
I thought was really fascinating speaking with her. There's a recent one that stands out as, and that was interesting because it was one where she actually has written a book that I hadn't read, and often, uh, I'd read some of her shorter writing, but we didn't really talk about her book. We more talked about her work, and I think as much as I love talking about people's work, it ended up being, kind of a memorable experience to talk about sort of her lived experience working with animals, whereas with others, it was often more about their either their academic research or their reporting, not as much their direct experience. Which again, I'm getting a PhD now. I appreciate and love that stuff too. But that's something that stood out as a little bit different than my other interviews in a positive way.
Has there been, what was a turning point or a shift in the life of the pod?
Well, I think one turning point was when I started the pod. It was during the pandemic. I was also dealing with some unrelated health issues. I moved back in with my parents. I didn't necessarily have a lot else going on. Um, so I was doing just a lot of episodes and a lot of reading for the podcast and having a lot of fun with it. But relatively early on in that first season, I also started getting back into like freelance and contract journalism work, writing and editing. Um, and so when I had other things on my plate, sometimes it became harder to make time for the podcast, or at least it just made me think a little more intentionally about which books and which authors to interview. I think maybe for the first half of season one, it was just like whoever I thought had an interesting book coming out, I wanted to talk with them.
Mm-hmm.
And when I didn't have time to do that anymore, I maybe had to think a little more intentionally about what like fits best with the theme of this podcast. And that's why in season two I kind of tried to separate it into, a 4-part series on animal agency and a 4-part series on the trouble with car dependency. Um, and just kind of tried to be less scattershot and maybe more, make some space to dig into a few specific issues.
Yeah, so some of those series that you did and the episodes where you were not interviewing anyone, it was just you basically telling a story or kind of delivering an essay on a topic. Some of those were my favorites. And you are you're a writer and editor, and I know you plan to publish books. But I'm curious, which of the books of the authors you interviewed do you wish that you had written?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of funny.
Like, no harm is
Yeah, yeah,
is
yeah.
no harm comes to the author. It's just an alternate universe where instead of the author having written that particular book, it's you who gets to enjoy the experience of having written that book.
Mm-hmm. So I have three that come to mind, pretty confidently for this, and it's ironically two of them are the first and the last episode that I posted, not including this one. I wish I wrote ABC's of the Real Dancing Eagle, but the very first one that came to mind is episode 1, Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World by Emma Maris. It's basically, for those who haven't listened to that episode, she takes a journalistic approach to analyzing various situations where the needs of sort of individual wild animals and the broader needs of the ecological whole and the functioning ecosystem either do or don't come to attention. So, like a simple example would be like zoos are a place where, ostensibly, for the broader goal of conservation of the species, individual or animals are kept confined and often, unhealthy or unideal circumstances. And she goes through a lot of other type of situations. And what I love so much about the book is one that she's a journalist. She talks with lots of scientists and philosophers about it. She does a lot of reading. She's a great writer. It's fun to read. But she also, unlike I think a lot of people who aren't philosophers, she spends a lot of time with the ethics and philosophy of this issue. Like she doesn't just want to interview a person who doesn't like zoos and a person who likes zoos and call it a day. She herself reads a ton about zoos and really digs into the ethical questions involved and offers her own thoughts, many of which I agree with, not all of which. But the way she presents them is also with a dose of humility, where she's not saying, I definitely have the final answer here. But it's just like an honest investigation. And that question of kind of individuals versus the wholes in wild animal ethics is potential. It's on my list of potential dissertation topics here at CU. I don't know. I'm in first semester of my first year. I have a lot of time to figure out what that looks like. But so that's maybe probably the book of any book I've read in the last many years. The one, even while I was reading it, I was just like, I really wish I'd written this book. Two others that stand out more recently that I will spend less time on. The last one I did, Crossings by Ben Goldfarb, about wild animal crossings and road crossings. I just thought it was a really nice work of science journalism, and just kind of opened my eyes to an issue that I kind of generally had a sense was probably a big deal. That probably cars were bad for wildlife. I'd seen roadkill on the side of the road, but just the scale of it and all the details of it was just so much I hadn't even thought to think about, really. And so that kind of just eye-opening new perspective on an important issue was inspiring for me. And then the last one I'll mention, that's kind of more on the academic side, was Eva Meyer, an academic I interviewed. Her book was When Animals Speak, Toward an Interspecies Democracy. That's also an issue that is a potential dissertation topic, right? This question of how to bring animals into our political systems, processes, institutions, and how we might transform our own politics to be more interspecies, more inclusive of other beings. So yeah, those three jump to mind.
I enjoyed those podcasts too, and yeah, I would enjoy reading those books, I'm sure.
And I should say too that part of part of choosing those is that they're ones that are closest to the sorts of things I could see myself doing. You know, like the other books I might love just as much, but might even feel more out of reach. Like I'll never be a professional paleontologist. I feel like that's my but those three at least feel
that ship sailed
within reach. We'll never say never, but probably not.
The ship sailed, but it's not buried. It can sail back.
Sunk. Yes.
Yes. So, yeah, what stood out to me is some of those are kind of, or at least the first one is kind of interdisciplinary in nature, which reminds me of your folks. And you said the humility that's kind of embedded in that and in the author's perspective. There's a rigor to bringing in, to synthesizing inquiry from multiple fields of study, but there's also a humility to it in that, insofar as, well, we couldn't figure everything out from this one angle, and so that's why we're opening it up, and we don't necessarily hope to. We wouldn't suppose to have opened it up as broad as possible either. Okay, are you down for a speed round?
All right, let's go.
Okay. What's the most important thing you've learned about animals?
That they like doing things. Like the fulfilled happy life for an animal isn't sitting around getting spoon-fed. It's they like doing stuff.
What's the most important thing you've learned about journalism and or interviewing?
That's a good one. You know, that interviewing when people are actually going to have to listen to me is very different than interviewing for written magazines when I get to just rewrite my question afterward. I have to be more precise. I have to be more precise in my questions rather than just kind of, and I also have to string together full sentences in a way that I didn't really have to when no one was actually going to listen to the audio.
Okay, what's the most important thing you've learned about storytelling?
That it is not a strictly human endeavor.
What's the most important thing you've learned about the brain?
That it will. I guess the most important thing I've learned is that we don't really know how the brain creates the mind. As that is to say, how the physical brain creates feeling, the experiences that we feel, and that uncertainty, that mystery, if you will, I think creates, for me anyway, some humility and some awe in how I look at other life forms that might have very different brains than me, such as perhaps the octopus or the bumblebee.
What's the most important thing you've learned about the environmental movement? Or ecological, the ecology movement, or the project of a better ecology as an agenda in the Western world?
I think that sometimes working at a kind of in, like, I would say, left media spaces, progressive, socialist-y, whatever, magazines and websites. A few years ago, I sometimes felt like A, there wasn't enough focus on this, and B, that kind of environmental, for most people, meant climate change. And that this was also true if you looked at presidential candidates in the Democratic Party, that often if you clicked on the environment section of their platform, it would be 99% about climate change, which obviously I'm part of what motivated me to get into this area is climate change. It's important. It's part of what I focus on, but there's so much more to it in habitat loss and pollution and species endangerment and a million other things that I'm not thinking of right now. But what I learned is that there actually is a lot of energy and interest in issues related to everything from environmental justice, air pollution in urban areas, to water pollution in rural areas, to desert ecosystem conservation, to the harms done by roads and wildlife, to bring it back to that. So that kind of at times in my past where I thought, why don't other people care about these other issues that I care about? Turns out actually lots of people did the whole time, and I just hadn't found them yet, or wasn't looking in the right places. So that's been nice.
What's your favorite animal?
Oh, I just read a pretty incredible essay about elephants. They're up there. I'm a big whale, like a humpback. Give me a good humpback whale, or gray whale. I part of me wants to sort of. I know this is supposed to be rapid fire, and I'm giving a longer answer, but I think there's a danger in focusing on only like big brained animals such as the elephant, the chimpanzee, or whales, dolphins, because we might say, oh, we should be nice to them, but not worry as much about smaller brained animals, which I think, as I mentioned earlier about the mystery of the brain, we shouldn't necessarily think of them as like dumber or less valuable because they don't have the precise types of complicated cognition that large brain mammals do. All that said, so part of me was trying to think of a representative species, like a fish or something. And I do love pufferfish, but
Snails?
yeah, I should have said snails. You're right. After that Tom Van Doren episode, I fell in love with snails. But I guess I also do think that there's something a bit magical about the way animals like social mammals like elephants, whales, you could throw in wolves, chimpanzees, apes, kind of blur the lines of the human and the non-human, and I think that's part of what is attractive about them to me, is that they aren't as different as an octopus, say, which I think octopuses are really, really cool in the way that they're different. But they're both very different and very the same in ways that kind of blur the boundary altogether in a way that I think is fun.
Speaking of having fun blurring boundaries, the question our listeners have all been waiting for. What was a formative encounter with an animal you've had in your life?
So did you have a specific one in mind when you brought this up?
There's the shirtless encounter with the deer.
Yeah, that's all I can think about too, so I'll just throw that one.
Yeah, let's just make it real out loud.
So,
No, literally.
I was in college. It was the summer between, I want to say, sophomore and junior year. So I had just turned 20 years old. And I was in Princeton, New Jersey. And one thing to know about Princeton, New Jersey is that it's kind of humid in the summer. So even in the middle of the night, it still doesn't get that cool. And so I was going for a run at like 11 p.m. or something because during the day it was too hot. And even at 6 p.m. it was too hot. And at 11 p.m. it was still a little too hot, but it was at least better. So I was running in the dark, and I was on my way back. I just gotten back to campus. And it was the summer, so it wasn't that crowded. And I saw a deer, and there was a like a street light area, but the road was empty. A deer just like right by the side of the road, grazing on some grass. And it was sort of right in the path I was planning to go down. And I didn't want to disturb the deer, but I also, I don't know, probably some of you like see deer all the time.
they aren't that rare, but I just was very excited to be so close to a deer on my run. And so I did. I forget if there were already two of them at this stage, or if the second one would arrive later. But I kind of wanted, so I was about to act it out with my hands, but listeners aren't going to be able to see this. So basically, I didn't want to scare this deer away, but I did want to get closer to the deer. And so I went kind of, I would say, in a spiral, where I went from behind the deer to like at an angle around the deer, and did kind of a full, like, more than 360 degrees, 450, so a full circle plus 90, where I got just slightly closer to the deer. And the deer at one point looked up at me, and I just like stopped, and I just tried to like exude non-threateningness. I don't know what that actually meant, but like, palms up, uh, non-aggressive posture. Keep doing what you're doing. And I like, also it was the middle of the night. I'd just been on a run. I maybe wasn't like thinking totally rationally, but I felt like if the deer ran away, that would have been like a fundamental failure on my part. Like that I had both just sort of the guilt of like, oh, this poor deer is just trying to enjoy some grass and I scared it away, and but also just like I wanted to have a connection, and if the deer had run away, it just would have shown that was kind of selfish and futile of me. So anyway, I do this little loop around the deer where I gradually get closer, and I end up sort of back in the street.
It's 1:00 by now.
Yeah, no, all thoughts of the quality of my run are gone. I was going very slowly. I end up in the street, and just really only a few feet away from this deer, who's still eating some grass, and I'm kind of flanking the deer, and I was simultaneously very close to the deer, and felt metaphorically very far. I was on a road, pavement. The deer was on grass. It was, it was grass that was planted by Princeton University. It probably, it wasn't like the deer was in the wilderness, but if, it felt different. The deer was on dirt. I was on asphalt. I was underneath a street light. I was lit. The deer was in the dark. I was human. The deer was not. I was struck by this distance, and just another way that difference manifested that I noticed at the time was that I was wearing clothes. I had a t-shirt, some shorts, some shoes, running shoes, and deer didn't need all that. Deer had hooves and fur and skin and whatnot. And it just, in my head, it was essential that I in some way bridge this gap between myself and the deer. And so I take my shirt off. And I do think I brought up earlier that it's very hot at night at Princeton. My shirt was very sweaty. Apologies, it's just a little gross, but it took me a minute to get the shirt off. This is important because it meant there were several seconds where the shirt was over my eyes and I couldn't see. Because when I finally can see again, the deer is staring right at me. And specifically, the deer is staring at my shirt, which is now in my hand, kind of held up over my head. And it's like the deer thinks I'm holding a weapon or a food or something. The deer is fascinated by the shirt. And I like slowly lower the shirt down, and the deer's gaze follows the shirt down. And I slowly lower the shirt down to the ground, asphalt. And I just kind of slowly back away. And I was on a road. I did briefly consider going further, but I decided losing my shirt was enough. And I kind of was like, Dayton, what's your end game here? Like, getting any closer would actually scare the deer away. Let's leave the deer in peace. And so I just kind of sneaked back, like crouched down and grabbed my shirt. and went home. But yeah, no, that I would analyze it, but I feel like it's all pretty clear. You know, who amongst us wouldn't, in a similar situation, feel compelled to strip before a deer? And
when it's so readily in your power to remove such a boundary
right,
between another creature and yourself, why wouldn't you
right.
exercise?
We had more in common after than before,
Mhm.
so that's a win.
If the deer could have spoken, it might have said, "Oh, I get it."
Like, how do you take yours off? Uh,
Well, thank you for that. It's one of my favorite stories. Um,
Thank you for asking.
okay, I have one. No, I have two more questions for you. Sorry, we got that part out. Okay, let's say you pick the pod back up after grad school
Mhm.
or in the middle of grad school. Who is your first? Uh, who is first on your list to interview?
Ooh. There's a couple different ways that could go. One thought I've had is that it could be fun to like interview people who like are at University of Colorado.
Hmm.
So either my advisor or other professors who do work that I find interesting. Um, the other thought that is sort of the one person who I most wish I'd interviewed in the first 2 seasons of the podcast is Amitav Ghosh. I brought up his work multiple times in episodes and also the Storytelling Animals book club. Read 2 of his books, The Great Derangement and The Nutmeg's Curse. I just think he has a lot of really interesting ideas about climate change and story and the narratives we tell about it, and the multi-species natures of those voices and more than human elements of that are part of the story of climate change. And I actually did reach out to interview him for season 2, but he said he basically that he'd just done a bunch of interviews and felt like he was repeating himself, and so he told me to circle back like in a few months when he has a new book or when he might have more things to say. But by the time that a few months had passed, I had started grad school, so that could be a season 3 episode 1 contender for sure.
That would be awesome. Okay, last question for you. What are your hopes for the future? Personal and ecological.
Well, personal, to obtain my doctorate. I also, you mentioned that I hope to write books. I do want to write. I have, at least 2 ideas for books in the next few years. Would love to get at least one of them in motion, and at the very least, hopefully, my dissertation can be turned into a book eventually. So I want to get a doctorate and write a book, and along the way, I want to keep writing for the public in some way, doing journalism. I don't want to only be writing for academic papers while I'm in grad school. I want to still be engaged in some way with the public, both as a writer and hopefully get involved in advocacy work in the area as well. Ecologically, what are my hopes? And personally also to be, good uncle, good partner, brother, family, to be good in my individual relationships as well, personal growth and such. Ecologically, what are my goals? To dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the near term for future. I think to do that in a way that I don't know if the phrase originates with the International Workers of the World, the IWW, which was an anarchist labor group or I guess still is, but was active in the early 1900s, or with another radical group, the phrase of building the new world in the shell of the old. has resonated with me. And so when I say we need to reduce emissions and restore wildlife habitat and protect endangered species and reduce pollution and all these sort of ecological goals, ideally, do so in a way that builds, that works towards building new relationships with each other, with other humans, with more than human nature, different relationships with our, the goods we produce, our workplaces, how we consume them, with our ways of getting around, with the ways we eat, and yeah, that just that we're not just sort of, I know we're not going to get to utopia in time to stop climate change, right? We need to work with the institutions we have. And maybe utopia isn't something you ever get to, it's something you build along the way. But yeah, that as we're doing what we need to do to combat climate change and mass extinction and whatnot, that we're doing so in a way that is, perhaps not overnight, but transforming and building a new world, a new way of relating to each other and to others beyond capitalism, beyond the nation state, beyond patriarchy and white supremacy and human supremacy, and just starting to get a glimpse of what some future utopia in the distant that we may not live to see, what it might look like, and start building it along the way.
All right.
So modest goals, but
Well, here's to hoping and working towards those. Thanks for sharing that. And I have to share my gratitude for both seasons of your podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed them. They delighted me, and they also were edifying and mobilizing, not just in terms of my curiosity and interest, but in terms of my own outlook for the present and future, and even my experience with the non-human world.
I just can I ask if there's any episodes or podcast guests who stood out to you?
I think I marveled perhaps most at the episode that on this the snail one. I'm sorry, I forget the author's name.
Tom Van Doren.
Okay, yeah, Tom Van Doren's interview was just really interesting, and like I know I'm going to read that book about snails, and I know I'm going to love it. And it's just all the more fun because I know that I had zero interest in snails before that podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But it gave me a kick in that direction that you mentioned, which I can relate to, of finding connection and affinity with the animal world, the plant world that's not necessarily the large brain mammal demographic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the one that comes up first for me. But if I had the list in front of me right now, I could go off on it probably, but I don't have a good answer right now.
No, that I like that you bring that up, and I think I said this on the show. I had the same experience where, obviously, I'm big into animals in general. I don't think I had any specific attachment to or thoughts about snails prior to picking up the book, and 20 pages in, I was like, I love snails. So I hope I was able to convey some of that, and yeah, I hope at least some listeners like yourself have been inspired to pick up some of these books as well.
Yeah, I've definitely found that one was delightful. I've also found a lot of them just satisfyingly rigorous, and whereas I might find content on some of the topics you cover other places in other forms of media, what your podcast offered was a very accessible press play speaking, a regular form of English and speaking, an accessible language, a very rigorous line of inquiry, and just found it deeply interesting. But I really want to congratulate you on the incredible work that you've done, and thank you for it as a fan, and put in my 2 cents that it'd be great if it came back someday. But if it doesn't, it's wonderful work that you've created.
Well, thank you so much, Kyle, and I'm grateful to you for listening. And I hope they were rigorous in some way. That probably the most common compliment I got from the people I interviewed afterwards was like some version of, "Oh, you like really read the book," and that's with a couple of exceptions that I note in those episodes. That's the Storytelling Animals guarantee. I read the books front to cover, and it's been fun to hear from. Obviously, I hear from you. You're my brother. But hear from other people who listen to the podcast. And I'm glad you feel strongly about it on the subject of snails. For those in the audience, for maybe the last year or so since that episode, Kyle has been maybe once a month sending me a video of a snail or a slug that he sees out and about.
Twice a week at least, I thought.
and yeah, I actually really like that. It has led to a bit more attention to the non-human world in a way. In at least that one small way, we both like slimy crawly things more.
If you've achieved nothing, you've lifted up gastropoda.
Yes. Which
ever so slightly.
Then I've achieved everything. Thanks so much. Your questions were great. This was great. I hope I didn't ramble too long. But yeah, I don't know, anything else that you want to bring up or add? Or
I don't think so. I think this is great. I really enjoyed getting to be on the last step.
It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope that was even partly as fun for you as it was for us. I've included a link in the episode description to my brother's book, which you should definitely buy. I have, I think, like I mentioned, friends who don't know my brother at all, but who have loved this book for the kids in their lives. And then, links to his other work, and then also to the article about elephants that I mentioned, having read recently. Thank you so much for listening. Whether to this or any prior Storytelling Animals podcast, feel free to reach out with any thoughts or feedback you have. I'd love to stay in touch as the podcast goes on hiatus. Hope you're having a great day.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.